Can you expound on the below quotation? Science is a bit like the joke about the drunk who is looking under a lamppost for a key that he's lost on some other side of the street, because that's where the light is. It has no other choice. So this comes from Noam Chomsky's letter to the author, 14th of June, 1993.
Okay. Well, that's what we're stuck with. We look under the lamppost where there is some. The story is about a drunk who's looking under a lamppost, and somebody comes up and asks him, "What are you looking for?" And he says, "I'm looking for a key." And the person asks him, "Where did you lose it?" He said, "Well, I lost it on the other side of the street." So you ask, "Well, why are you looking here then?" Because that's where the light is. There's no light over there. That's what we're stuck with. We're looking where there is some level of understanding. Maybe the answer is somewhere else. Well, occasionally there are people like Einstein, let's say, who says, let's look under a different lamppost, but it's pretty rare in the history of science.
Is the mind-body problem misconceived? If so, how so?
Well, we have to ask first what it is. There is a classical mind-body problem, basically Cartesian. Descartes famously postulated res cogitans alongside of res extensa. So there's extended entity that's matter, physical, material. Then there's the mental world, which is separate from that. Look for some connection between them. That was a perfectly reasonable scientific hypothesis, nothing mystical about it. Descartes, like all scientists of the period from Galileo through Newton and beyond, adopted what was called the mechanical philosophy, the idea that the world is a complex artifact, sort of like the artifacts that skilled artisans were producing at the time, quite very extensively all over Europe. Skilled artisans were producing mechanical clocks that could do all sorts of complicated things. The fountain, the gardens at Versailles, as you walked through them, all kind of things were happening, and things that looked like people playing a role in plays and so on. And then Galileo, his contemporaries, and others, Leibniz, Newton concluded, well, that's what the world is, just a complicated system, but basically mechanical, gears, levers, things pushing and pulling each other, and so on. Descartes just routinely assumed that, everyone did. And then Descartes tried to show that his main scientific work was to try to show that, in fact, you could give a mechanical explanation for phenomena of the world, including a good deal of human understanding and behavior of sensation and perception. He thought he could give a mechanical interpretation of that. But he observed that some things don't fall within that. In fact, one of his main examples in the Discourse on Method was language. He said, if you look at what people are doing there, there's no mechanical interpretation for what you and I are now doing. It's maybe impelled by circumstances, but not compelled by them. You could choose differently, and you choose appropriately. So somehow people are making appropriate, undetermined use of language in ways that we could call creative. It's a long history behind this. He wasn't the first to point it out. But then, like any scientist, he postulated a principle to account for this. That's the second principle, res cogitans. That's the classical mind-body problem. Well, it was the props were knocked under it by Newton, who didn't say anything about the mind, but he showed that the mechanical system is not true, showed the world is not a mechanical system. His famous comment, I make no hypotheses, is because he said, I have no physical explanation. I can just say, here's the way it works. Here's the mathematical principles. Well, that ended the mind-body problem in the classical sense. Until somebody tells us what matter is, nobody can tell that up to the present day. Then there's no mind-body problem in the classical sense. This was understood, incidentally, like John Locke, immediately after the appearance of Principia, pointed out that he put it in a theological framework, standard framework of the day. He said, just as Newton has shown, God assigned properties to matter that we cannot conceive of. He said, similarly, God may have superadded to matter the principles of thought. In other words, thought is just some form of organized matter where we don't know what matter is, but whatever it turns out to be, the tides, the planets, so on, they follow it by principles we can't understand, but we can work with them. And maybe thought is the same. That was pursued very extensively through the 18th century by leading figures. They reached its peak with Joseph Priestley, chemist, philosopher, at the end of the 18th century. It was quite extensive studies of how thought can be a property of organized matter. Then it was pretty much forgotten, rediscovered in the late 20th century without any knowledge of the history, and it's now considered part of philosophy and neuroscience, but it comes straight out of the collapse of the mind-body problem. Well, is there another mind-body problem? Well, commonly these days, the mind-body problem is formulated in totally different terms, unrelated to the classical one. It's usually formulated in terms of first person versus third person conceptions of the world. So the first person conception is what I sense. The moon. The moon's big on the horizon. That's first person. The third person approach is what the scientist from the outside says about it. If you pursue that, you get different conclusions. Some people call that a mind-body problem. I think that's a very bad term for it.
Thank you, sir. Would it be fair to argue that one reason why ChatGPT and other large language models seem so human-like in their responses is that as a result of their training, they have inferred, that is, made sense of, an underlying and immanent semantic grammar to map the various sentences to their corresponding semantic underpinnings? If you'd like, you can watch this video by Sabine Hossenfelder, a physicist, arguing that ChatGPT does indeed understand language.
Does an artificially intelligent chatbot understand what it's chatting about? A year ago, I'd have answered this question with clearly not. But I've now arrived at the conclusion that the AIs that we use today do understand what they're doing, if not very much of it. I'm not saying this just to be controversial. I actually believe it, I believe.
I took a look at the first half of the video. I didn't follow it through, but she's a very good physicist, but I think she's asking meaningless questions.
If you enjoyed that clip, then the full podcast is out right now. You can click around here, as well as subscribe to get notified. Enjoy. Brand new full-length podcasts every Tuesday at 2 p.m. on Theories of Everything.